Video games have been around for a really long time, since the late 1950s, with the first game being a digital tic-tac-toe by A.S. Douglas. But about 60 years later, the industry has jumped from 2D pixels to 3D lifelike worlds and characters, which is a rapid but impressive evolution in graphics. In this video, I'll be discussing the pros and cons for realistic versus stylized graphics, ask people questions based on the topic, and give my own take on it, as well as to settle on the two big questions. Which of them is really better, and is there an oversaturation on either side? In this video, I'm referring to realistic graphics as those that are considered the present-day standards, but also what was considered that in the earlier days of gaming. We started off with photorealism as far back as the 90s, from the likes of Half-Life, Mortal Kombat, or even cheesy kung fu action movie, The Game. Although in recent years, we've drastically improved from the resolution to the textures and models, with games such as Red Dead Redemption 2, Arkham Knight, Mafia 3, and many more. Depending on the game's environment and genre, its graphics can enhance a player's immersion. RPGs, for example, can have some more breathtaking natural scenery and lifelike characters in an exciting fictional world. Horror games can also be more bone-chilling with photorealism because the immersion puts the player in an isolated, dark atmosphere. Mystery games immerse the player in the role of a detective and try to uncover the most intricate details hidden in a crime scene. Most sports games allow the player to be fully immersed into the world when playing as their favorite sports team or even shredding rubber on streets. FPS war games can depict the state of its environment with a grim atmosphere, and fighting games can add gore with visuals to make a punch in the face look more brutal. I could pull more genres to explain how this would work, but you get the point. The artists and designers can go far lengths to making these games look as real as possible, and we can look at this from a technical standpoint. In an article from AD Level called Realism vs. Stylized Technique Overview, an asset and environment artist by the name of Kim Ava examines the differences between these two types of graphics with some 3D objects such as a mandarin and a wooden stump. Looking at the mandarin example, we can see that the stylized version heavily exaggerates a plain simple texture with some small amount of detail and has a slightly curved shape because of its low poly nature. There are some noticeable similarities between the two versions, such as the skin wrinkles on the top, as well as the lighting facing in the same direction. However, the realistic looking mandarin is more curved than the former example and also has even more pores on its skin. Now, moving on to the wooden stump example, there's a lot more details that can be discussed over. Some of the features are that the realistic stump has a deeply detailed bark texture, there are more rings on the top, and it almost looks as if it's photographed. However, these kind of games are very expensive to produce. They require investing huge amounts of money into upgrading hardware and purchasing the latest software for game development, animation, creating textures for models, etc. It also makes modeling very time consuming, and unwrapping the model before texturing could be very complicated because you need to make sure that the textures don't stretch or compress to a terrible degree. These games' graphics could also be outdated quickly if AAA studios keep raising the limits for every 3D photorealistic game to be made, meaning that their standard for it could be changed from within a few months to a couple of years. Most games currently use a technique called rasterization, which basically means that data in the game is converted from 3D assets onto the pixels of a flat screen. From the lighting to the colors of the objects, everything from the game is flattened onto where it's being displayed based on the camera angle of the player. Ray tracing has started to become more preferred because it provides better results. Rather than rendering each pixel, it renders large amounts of it present in a scene to create things like more detailed shadows and reflections, as well as better illumination. Since 2018, it's been implemented with games such as Metro Exodus, Battlefield 5, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Control, Call of Duty's Modern Warfare remake, and even Minecraft. Although it isn't a mainstream requirement for all video games because it's more costly to invest in than using rasterization. If it becomes the next norm, customers would have to upgrade their PCs by purchasing more expensive GPUs. Fortunately, the recently launched PS5 and Xbox Series consoles all have that taken care of. But in short, continually aiming for photorealism in games can cost a lot for everyone involved in the industry. It also requires a huge amount of effort to pull off, with the teams behind these games having to constantly perfect aspects such as lighting, texture details, animation, motion capture, rigging, etc. If there is some faulty animation or awfully made models, players could perceive the games as not realistic or immersive enough, and may not even like the game because of that. This effect that people experience is called the uncanny valley. The reason why being is as shown on this graph. When the viewer sees an artistic work that looks real but isn't exactly close to it, the dotted graph curves downwards, forming a deeper valley curve than in the solid graph. This downward curve represents the viewer feeling a sense of repulsion and disbelief. Basically, that means for anything that's holding back from the graphics being completely realistic, it may push people away from it. In a handful of cases, it may also increase the production time by years. Some games were developed for only less than 5, such as most of the annually launched Assassin's Creed games, The Witcher 3, the new Tomb Raider games, as well as Call of Duty. This might be due to certain developer cycles where some studios carry a part of the main studio's work to lighten the load, or otherwise reuse assets but tweak them a bit to fit the next title. While there have been games developed close to a decade, like LA Noire, Duke Nukem Forever, or Red Dead Redemption 2. Not to mention that because when trying to finish the game within months from its launch date, sometimes there's a likely case of crunch time to happen, which could take anywhere above 50-hour work weeks to even as high as 100-hour work weeks, which is very unhealthy and not efficient for the teams. I'm not saying that making more of these games will lead to crunch time, but there's a handful of stories with certain games that had its realism pushed unnecessarily. To sum this up, I'm not saying that realistic graphics are bad. I don't mind their aim to be as lifelike as possible, but because it constantly gets more expensive for everyone and even pushes the studio employees really far, it doesn't really need to be a huge focus on what makes a game great. Stylized graphics are obviously the opposite of photorealism, but they still make up for it in their own way. Unlike realistic graphics, these games don't have a standard to meet, meaning that they don't always have to look lifelike. Some examples of stylized games are Okami, A Hat in Time, and Hotline Miami. Now, an obvious positive about stylized games is that they use a broader variety of distinctive art styles, which makes them look fresh. Some of the various art styles used in these games range from cel shading, pixel art, and hand-drawn visuals. The game's artists and designers who use them have much more freedom of artistic choice, which means that however they implement it doesn't have to represent any similarity to real life. The art style used may help complement the game in more ways than just to look appealing. Okami, for example, is a game that is heavily inspired by traditional Japanese art, such as the ukiyo-e paintings and the sumi-e art style. Okami's art style fits so well with the game because it's mostly focused on Japanese mythology and folklore in the Edo time period. However, it wouldn't be as admiring as it is had they swapped it for a more semi-realistic approach, or even just a different style irrelevant of what Okami is about. Another game that blends art style with gameplay is Hollow Knight, which is entirely hand-drawn animation. The characters and enemies are animated so fluidly, it won't lag most of the time. It also features different stages in Hollow Nest with unique color schemes that can help you memorize them. For example, stages like Forgotten Crossroads use a set of dark colors in its environment. Green Path has a brighter color scheme with lush scenery, and areas like Resting Grounds utilize a palette of gray and light colors to depict a serene and peaceful atmosphere. The graphics of these games are also quite timeless, and unlike realistic games, they can be appreciated and admired for a long time. In addition, they can also be easily updated and are easy to port onto newer gen consoles by just raising the resolution and some small tweaks, rather than remastering it from the ground up to make them more detailed. Take a look at the Hotline Miami games for example. The graphics are made to emulate the 80s arcade vibe, but it was only made less than a decade ago, and it still looks great because of its colorful palette as well as the sprites. People also appreciate Borderlands for its comic style shading, which is also something that doesn't aim for realism, unlike every typical FPS game. If Borderlands swapped it for a grittier approach, it might have not had the same amount of admiration or attention from fans, and it would have looked like another underwhelming FPS. While there are people that do appreciate stylized games, they don't really grab the attention of most others. These games may look simplistic and unappealing to people who enjoy looking at realistic graphics over immersing themselves into a stylized world. There are exceptions for stylized games that sold well or attracted tons of players, with games such as Minecraft, Cuphead, and Genshin Impact. Although I would say that the game probably attracted people more due to the enjoyment of the game rather than its art style alone, but maybe they did end up liking the visuals along the way. Another reason why these graphics aren't used too often is that it may or may not work well with some games depending on their direction. Imagine if something like Call of Duty turned over a new leaf with a cel-shaded art style that might make it look like another Fortnite or Team Fortress 2 clone. Most of the horror games that we all know probably wouldn't work with a stylized art direction rather than focusing on realism, because games like Outlast or Silent Hill wouldn't be too terrifying or eerie had they done so. That's not to say that they can't be scary, because there are many games that can do so even with those kind of graphics, like Doki Doki Literature Club, I'm Scared, Little Nightmares, and Baldi. And finally, some developers and publishers use the medium as a cheap and quick way to make games where they don't need to be used. That's not to say that it's been rarely used because of this, because there are many titles that use it just as much as titles that focus on realism, and those are still done really good regardless. However, it takes far less time in the entire production pipeline than making unique photorealistic games. This is usually because they either reuse the art style for building a franchise out of it, or create rip-offs that exploit the trend of a successful game. A good example of the first case is the new Super Mario Bros. Series. The first few games were acceptable with the typical 3D Mario in 2D platformer level style, but the rest of their entries didn't try anything to innovate or even stand out in some way. Mario games have never looked so similar with the majority of their series, because their art style is what also makes their identity. But with this series, it feels as if New Super Mario Bros. Is just trying to be a remake of the original Super Mario Bros. Games. Looking into the latter half of the issue, there are many cases of shovelware, as in the trend of making a lazy game to promote some characters based on famous properties, like in movies and TV series. There's various titles that try to recreate the successors, thinking they'll do similar, but eventually end up in clearance bin for years. Before I move on, I want to remind everyone that stylized graphics do matter. They're mostly great because you can do more than look pretty, like relating with the story, help make levels be more unique and memorable, and take far longer to age out of time. The only reason why it's not that popular is because not a lot of people appreciate them. But like I said before, that doesn't mean their taste isn't valid. It's just something that they prefer. For this part of the video, I asked a couple of close friends and some of my favorite YouTubers to share their thoughts about the debate with these few questions.
Well, it depends on the type of game, really. Minecraft is a game that I can get lost in for hours and hours on end, and it doesn't look all that great with its graphics. It's a very pixelated game and it's not super detailed, but what is rewarding about it is the gameplay. Then you play a game like Splinter Cell Chaos Theory, where the graphics are literally built into the gameplay. The lighting and shadows can drastically alter the way you play and change your playstyle and make you do different approaches to different scenarios in the game, which is amazing, and I love that, and I still haven't seen anything like that in a game where graphics are incorporated into the gameplay.
It really depends on the game and what it's going for, but generally I would say graphics are just as important as most other aspects of a game, or even more important than others. Graphics can and do enhance gameplay and even stories. A lot of games would be worse without carefully designing the graphics to work with the other elements. And I don't just mean having good graphics in the sense of poly count or textures, but an intelligent design that gives you all the information you would need clearly from a glance. Stuff like the way enemies look or move or what color they are, or level design that visually guides you or tells a story. Also knowing when to have restraint and not clutter up the screen. Good graphics are more than just the capabilities of the hardware.
I feel like my position on this is slightly skewed because I'm a 3D artist, so I enjoy game graphics, not only because they look good and aid the experience, but because I know what goes into them and I often look at them as reference almost. And just knowing what goes into creating certain environments or characters or whatever, I feel like I've got a real deep appreciation for that and the craft that goes into it. So I would say that graphics are very important for me. I understand why some people think gameplay is more important. If a game has good graphics but isn't fun, I'm also not going to enjoy it. But I'll let average gameplay slide a lot more if it's a really good looking game.
A game can have incredibly shit graphics but really good gameplay, characters and sound design, and I'm still going to think it's a really good game. If it looks good on top of all of that, that's fine, that's just a nice bonus. But the first things I'd be concerned about is the story and the gameplay. If the gameplay can reel me in and the story's shit, I can play that game for days. Likewise, if the story is really good, but the gameplay is flicking through menus, I'm still going to be in it for the story. The graphics won't really play that much of a part in that keeping me engaged bit of the game.
Well, I'm a sucker for any type of game's graphics, but the game itself is the priority to me. I can play a game as good looking as Battlefield 5, as well as I can play a game that looks just like classic Doom.
I much prefer stylized graphics. I find most games going for realistic styles to be very boring looking or even blend together if they don't have enough distinct environment or character design. Realistic graphics have their place absolutely, and I do like the way some games going for that style look, but 9 times out of 10 I'd rather have stylized graphics. You can do a lot more unique with it and make the game much more visually distinct, which is something I value a lot when it comes to graphics. I also unironically love low poly graphics like the N64 and can't stand it when people say they look ugly. It is its own style with its own charm.
I like both, but it really just depends how it complements the game. Something like Red Dead Redemption 2, for example, probably one of the most beautiful games I've ever played. Very realistic. But that suits the sort of gritty narrative that they were going for, whereas something like the new Crash Bandicoot, which looks amazing, obviously that's very stylized and that suits that game. Like, that game would look fucking disgusting if Crash Bandicoot was a realistic Bandicoot, and vice versa. If Red Dead was really stylized, it wouldn't have the same sort of emotional weight to the story, I don't believe. So I couldn't tell you which one I enjoy more. It really just depends on the game. If it fits the game, the style of the game, and what the story's trying to provoke, then I think that's what matters more than like which would I rather play, because I don't really have a strong preference.
Without a shadow of a doubt, it's stylized graphics, because you can put graphics in a box like, say, fantasy, for example. You can grab 2 games that would fit under that banner, like Divinity Original Sin 2 versus Journey. Both of those games could fall under the fantasy genre, but they look distinct from one another. I don't think realistic games can really provide that much. Sure, they'll look nice, they will be pretty to look at, I won't deny them that. Like, Red Dead Redemption 2 is a pretty graphically realistic game. You know, your beard grows in real time, if you go through a muddy field, patches of mud and dirt are going to stick to your boots as you walk along, stuff like that. But I don't think it's as good as a stylized game might be, because if you've got a distinctive stylistic art style to your game, that's immediately going to make it recognizable when people look at footage for it, as opposed to something that looks realistic. If you lined up a bunch of military shoes together, which undeniably need realistic graphics to portray the real world weapons they're using, without knowing beforehand, most of them are going to look the same. But if you've got a stylized graphics game, Hyperlight Drifter, Fury, Ghost Runner, you could see one screenshot from them and immediately know it's from that game. So I think, in terms of me, stylized graphics beats out the realistic shit by a little bit.
Somewhat. Games have this weird trend that's been going on, like Battlefield 5. When that game came out, It was one of the best looking games I had ever seen in my entire life. But the game was lacking in content, it was buggy, and there were a lot of issues at launch. Anthem is also a great looking game. You can get easily distracted by the gorgeous set pieces and the mechanics of the flying, but that just hides the fact that the game lacks any real content or incentive to keep playing the game, and there's no foundation within that game. But it sure does look pretty. You know, a wise man once said you can polish a turd, but it will still be a piece of shit. I'd rather have a content-filled game that looks rather poor than a polished piece of poop.
In the AAA industry, excluding Nintendo, I do believe there is an oversaturation of photorealistic games. Graphics are important to games, but they focus more on making the games look advanced than making them look good. This leads to a lot of games looking very similar to each other, and there's less variety in art styles in the AAA industry. This has gotten better since the 7th gen, but I'd say it's still a bit of an issue. Thankfully, we have Nintendo and indie developers to balance this out, so I wouldn't say there's overall an oversaturation just within the AAA industry. You could say there used to be an oversaturation of stylized graphics, but I wouldn't say that's an issue because stylized isn't a single visual style, so there's still a lot more variety.
I suppose it depends whether you're looking at AAA or indie. In AAA, maybe, I'd say more and more games are trying to push towards photorealism, but I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it definitely helps push 3D graphics further by sort of aspiring to reach that photorealism. And then some of those techniques can then be applied to non-photorealistic games, like again, say Crash Bandicoot, for example, has a lot of very nice particle effects and I believe possibly some volumetric fog even. Like there's a lot of nice effects that came about from people trying to emulate realistic graphics that you can then apply to these other types of art styles that also elevates them up. No, I feel like as with anything, you can, especially with the indie scene, there's a lot of stylized games out there as well if you're looking to find something like that. It's like saying all music today is bad, and it's like, well, you're obviously just not looking hard enough. You're just looking at, you know, maybe the top 20 or whatever's the most popular. Like there's really good non-photorealistic stuff out there as well if you go looking for it. But like I couldn't really say for certain. It seems like it's semi-balanced, in my opinion anyway.
Yes, if they devoted more time to making the game better rather than polishing textures and making characters' faces emote slightly fucking better and rendering pores where there doesn't need to be any, they'd probably end up with a better game. Perfect example, Last of Us 2, Red Dead Redemption 2. Those are very pretty looking games. They also have a lot of problems with them that could have been solved if they didn't spend so long tidying up the smallest of details, like, oh, this one box in the shop in Red Dead Redemption 2 has a slightly warped texture, better get in there and just polish that one up a little bit. Same story with Last of Us 2. Instead of spending however long they had to rendering the pores on Ellie's face, you could have put more work into hiring a better writing staff to make that game actually halfway tolerable.
Before I made this video, my original answer to the age-old question was that games with a stylized art direction were way better than photorealism. Not in terms of fidelity, of course, but it's a preference. This was mostly because I loved the effort in making so many unique art styles. However, that all changed after I spent so much time researching, writing the script, and openly listening to others' voices on it. And right now, I no longer believe that stylized graphics are better than realistic graphics. In fact, they matter just as much as realistic graphics do. While I do enjoy visually unique titles, the games don't entertain me solely because of their art style. I also enjoy playing realistic games, not for the sake of the graphics, but rather for things like the narrative or gameplay. I can't really say that stylized graphics are far superior to realistic graphics, because a game shouldn't only be appreciated or disliked by their graphics. There are some good and bad stylized games, as well as some good and bad realistic games, but they all fail or succeed by whether or not it entertains us as a game the most. I made this video not just to put out my 2 cents on the topic, but it was also because I believe that nowadays there's an oversaturation of games trying to be as lifelike as possible. That there are too many games trying to outdo each other for best graphics of the current standard. Even after making the script and editing this video, I still stand by that belief. But that's not to say that photorealistic games need to stop being developed permanently. It's just that most of the recent releases have just been using realistic graphics, and it may eventually be tiring to see nothing but games trying to compete for each other. I'm still excited to play upcoming games with that kind of graphics, like Evil West, Back 4 Blood, and Halo Infinite. But I think it's time we should see a balance of stylized and realistic games, so that there's no oversaturation of either graphic style. Thanks to everyone who watched this video throughout the end. It really makes my day knowing that you spent your company and time with me. And I'm also glad that I finally got to put something out that took quite a long time to make, but ended up being what I wanted it to be and more. This video wasn't just an interest in the topic itself, but as someone who's studying to be an animator in the near future, I decided to make this something that could help work with my future career. I'm normally used to making reviews and critiques of whatever it is, but with this video, I'm glad that it pushed me out of my comfort zone, and I hope to do more like this soon. Also, special thanks to those that collabed for the interview. Really great people who make some amazing content, like infamous Sir Hellfire, Many Kudos, The Red Guy, and my boy Paragon Mitchell. I highly recommend that you go check out their channels after this video, because not only have they been very helpful in making this one, but their own videos have managed to influence me with some of my recent work. Anyway, that's about it for today. Thanks again for watching the video and supporting it. Feel free to subscribe and check out my other socials as well as the people involved. And I'll see you guys in the next video.